Good
We
morning.
have the pleasure today to have you here at the Fachhochschule. It's interesting to welcome you here because you are a French-born engineer
Yes.
and now work in Canada as a cross-cultural consultant.
Yes.
And you are here today for a workshop on how to effectively communicate in the global IT world.
Yes.
So let's maybe talk a bit more about what that actually means. First of all, well, it's quite interesting. You are originally an engineer. Why did you actually move into the consultant business, and especially this particular topic?
Oh, that's a good question. So, originally I have a PhD in chemical engineering from the California Institute of Technology. So I worked for Procter & Gamble and for Xerox for about 4 years each. Both companies I ended up working with people from all over the world. We were a team of engineers. You know, everybody has an engineering degree, everybody speaks English, some better than others. And we were getting nowhere. I mean, and I could see that cultural differences were a big factor in our lack of progress. I didn't have the skills to convince my management to do something about it. I wouldn't even have known what to do about it at the time. And so what ended up happening is, when I had the same problem at Xerox as I did at P&G, I figured, okay, P&G and Xerox cannot be the only two companies that have that problem. So I decided to study it, and over time I realized, hey, there must be a market here. So that's how I became a consultant.
So what you are actually saying is that culture is an important factor in business. A lot of people would probably claim, why? I mean, don't we all have the same goal in business?
Well, do we really have the same goals? Okay, my experience is no. People are not motivated by the same things. Okay, if I take the example of Americans tend to be motivated by being the best or being the biggest. So every American company wants to become the IBM or the Microsoft or the Facebook of the world. Like they want to take over, and they focus on market share. People in Canada focus on niche marketing. They want to have some narrow thing. French people tend to be motivated at the individual level more by vacation than by money. So French companies want to be the best in one area, but they don't aspire to be the kind of universal norm kind of thing. So I find people do not have the same goals. Even when they have the same goals, they don't have the same idea of how to get there in many cases. And that creates a lot of problems in teams, particularly in the IT world, because IT people are very prone to the assumption that, a program, C++ is the same everywhere around the world. So therefore, how can cultural differences impact us? Well, the answer is, on the technical side, it doesn't. But the way you work with your colleagues, so being a good team player, being a good manager, be a good supplier, all this means very different things to different people.
Makes sense, and I assume that a lot of people would see, okay, the difference between, let's say, an Austrian IT person and Chinese or Japanese, Indian would be quite obvious. Yeah? And then they would say, okay, we concede that there's a difference. But you were mentioning already before that the goals are quite different. Where would you see the major differences in working together, for example, with North Americans?
Okay. Well, what I find is most Europeans, I mean, that is definitely not specific to Austria. I mean, I've seen it with just about every European country I've worked with. Most Europeans significantly overestimate their understanding of North America, particularly the United States. Well, first of all, for most Europeans, the US and Canada are one and the same, which drives Canadians crazy. So that's one. The other one is most Europeans think they understand the United States way better than they actually do. There's a good reason for it. Okay? If you look at movies, at least 50% of the movies we go see on, in the movie theater are Americans. On the news, I think the American president is there probably every day. Okay, so we think we understand North America because we see them all the time. What is very important to remember is that what you see on TV or in the movies is not the life of the average person. Nobody cares. No movie has ever been made about the life of the average IT professional. Okay? That would be boring. Nobody would pay to watch that movie, so nobody will make that movie. Okay? So the idea is we always see people in extreme situations. And the challenge is when we work as IT professionals, we're not in these extreme situations, we're in everyday stuff. And the average North American does not know that Austria is different. And the average Austrian thinks that they understand Americans. So my experience is when we work together, it comes back and haunts us down the road. Not immediately. Initially, it looks everything like is fine for a few weeks, maybe a few months. And then after that, the wheels fall off the project. Things are not working well.
What would you now say are those, or some of those sensitive areas where actually project teams could fail?
So one of the biggest areas where I find is, obviously, if people from Austria work with people in the United States of Canada, they're going to work in English. And so what I find is, for the average American does not learn any foreign language. Okay? I mean, if you look at their educational system, the only mandatory part when it comes to foreign language education is maybe 1 year of something in high school, and in many cases it ends up being Spanish. So the average American has absolutely no concept of what it is like to operate in a second language all day long. So you end up with many misunderstandings. German and English are close enough that there's a number of words that look the same, but they don't necessarily mean the same. And so I have seen so many misunderstandings around this. Okay, right now I can't think of any one that I've seen in terms of German and English misunderstanding, but I'll give you an example between French and English, because that one happened to me, and so I remember it very vividly. The French word demander translates in English into ask. Unfortunately, it's very close to the English word demand. Demand sort of means asking, but with a gun. I mean, it's not nearly as nice. Okay? So I can tell you that when I worked at Procter & Gamble, I sent email messages to my colleagues demanding data. All my colleagues were all outraged that I was demanding when I had absolutely no right to demand. Okay? And I had no intention of demanding.
Okay, so apart from language, which I can fully understand that this can cause misunderstandings, there's the infamous stereotype about German speakers actually being much too direct, and that would be a classic example of something similar. What about the area of risk-taking? Because North Americans are usually categorized as very entrepreneurial. What about that?
And there certainly are, and particularly in the IT industry, like if you work with Silicon Valley, I mean, it's just absolutely striking. And what I find is when Austrians and Germans work with North Americans, like Americans or Canadians, they often run into difficulties around like how much risk can we tolerate in a particular project. So the way it shows up is when we're at the beginning of the project, I've seen Germans and Austrians, they're planning the project. They're trying to anticipate what might happen if. What are we going to do if this happens or that happens? And invariably Americans will tell them, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. And then the reaction on the other side of the Atlantic is, whoa, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So we could save ourselves so much trouble if we were studying ahead of time, okay? And so when they work together, you often have tremendous tension in teams. Technical teams are particularly prone to that issue, okay? Because people don't realize that it is a cultural difference. So at that point, the way people will interpret the situation is, well, they'll phrase it like this: where did these guys get their degrees? How could you be doing this? It just, like, where didn't you take a course? Like, this doesn't make any sense. Okay, where did you learn to manage a project? So risk taking, in my experience, it translates into how much information do you need to make a decision and feel comfortable you're making the right decision. Mm-hmm. Well, Germans and Austrians need way more information than Americans do to make a particular decision. Mm-hmm. So you end up with this tension in teams that is very, very strong.
And often we see that IT project teams are have quite a low level of hierarchy. Would you say that is still a factor?
It does play a role. It does play a role in terms of that one, in my experience, impacts way more Americans and Southern European, Latin Europeans, like whether French, Italians, Greeks, whatever, because those cultures are obviously much more hierarchical than, say, Austria or Germany. At the same time, it still impacts, where the difference is very visible is how formally is a decision made. So I have been in tons of meetings in the US where we come out of the meeting and everybody goes, that was a good meeting, we made a lot of decisions. And my reaction was, we made decisions? It didn't seem to be like we made decisions, but a decision was made. It just wasn't stated as explicitly as what I was used to. Kind of comes back to your directness that you mentioned earlier. So when you have a meeting with Austrians or Germans and a decision is made, it's very clear. A decision has been made. Like, you cannot miss it. But in the US, you can certainly miss it if you're not paying attention.
Would that also be an issue, on the one hand, the directness, or this sort of more implicit message when feedback is given?
Feedback, in my experience, is I would say, number 2 issue in the workplace. Okay, number 1 being working with your boss. Okay, feedback. I mean, no organization can operate, no team can operate without people giving one another feedback. I like your idea. No, I don't think it's a great idea. We should do it this way instead. Whatever. And the challenge is, I mean, Germans and Austrians come across to North Americans as bulls in china shops. That's going to be the expression they use. Okay. Well, I'll give you an example. My advisor was from Austria. Okay. And I remember that any negative feedback session used to start with, "This is totally unacceptable." And I remember that, well, I took it, certainly it was very strong by my standards, but I'm French. It was not nearly as much, it didn't have nearly as much of an impact on me as it did on my American colleagues. For them, this is totally unacceptable. Oh my God, this is the end of the world. I'm going to be kicked out of university. And anything after this is totally unacceptable, it could range from, well, you've been late twice last week, don't do it again, to, yes, you will be kicked out of university, and anything in between could follow. Okay? So it was very, very stressful. I remember working for Manfred. It was a very challenging time. Yeah.
I can imagine. Especially if we speak also of this, under quotation marks, old type of professor that maybe doesn't exist in this pure format anymore.
Yeah.
But one issue that, of course, is relevant for a lot of people today, and with the migration and immigration we have in a lot of European countries, but of course also in Canada, the big question that arises very often is who actually needs to adapt to whom? What is your experience? What works best? Because you're also advising the Canadian government on how to best integrate immigrants into the workforce.
Well, I wish I was advising the Canadian government. I end up advising Canadian organizations, corporations more often than the government. But that's a different story. So this is a question where I've given a lot of thought because I've been on both sides of the equation. Like when I was in France, I was part of the mainstream. When I'm in Canada, I'm an immigrant. And so the question of who should adapt to whom is something that comes, well, people don't phrase it like this, okay? But it boils down to that, all right? And so what I've found is, well, First of all, there's a cultural component to it. So if you think of it as, let's say this is the bar that represents the gap that we have to bridge between immigrants on one side and, locals, whatever, citizens on the other. So how are we going to split that responsibility? So mentally, I think people quite often think of it as, there should be a percentage for each group, and these two percentages will add up to 100, okay? So I find that what the consensus in each country will vary. So in Canada, I would say most people are happy with 80-20. In the US, 80-20 doesn't work. I've tested it out. I told American audiences, 80-20, their reaction was, whoa, 20% is too much, 10% is okay. Okay. Now, if you ask Donald Trump supporters, they may say 0. That's a different story. But 90-10 seems to be okay to many Americans. In Western Europe, what I found is the answer tends to be 99-1. You adapt to us, we don't adapt to you. Okay. Actually, when I said this in France, one guy joked and he said, in France it's 105 minus 5. Immigrants need to make 105%, we'll do minus 5. It was it's a joke, obviously, but it's very symptomatic and very representative of the mindset. Okay. In Japan, the concept of adaptation does not exist. You and I cannot become Japanese. Okay, that's a fact of life, as far as they're concerned. So the split is cultural. I find that depending on the country, I know in Canada we have consensus. I don't think there is consensus in France because I think French people would either want immigrants to leave or make all the effort, or pretty much all the effort, whereas immigrants would probably like the French people to make some effort, or at least more than what they're making. But anyway, the real issue I find in virtually everywhere around the world is everyone underestimate how big the issue actually is, how big the gap actually is. So instead of being this big, it's this big. And so at some point we end up quite often in a situation where everybody goes, I've done my part, it's your turn. And now we get stuck. So what I would say is the essence of my work is, when I work with corporations, is really trying to make people realize the gap is much bigger than you thought. Now, I don't want to leave people with an idea, oh my God, that's an insurmountable mountain, we will never be able to solve that problem. No, there's plenty of things we can do to make things better, okay? That message resonates, in my experience, way more in North America than in Europe. What I mean by that is, in North America, it typically, in a workshop, it takes me about an hour and a half to convince Americans that 1, cultural differences exist, 2, they have an impact, 3, they matter to you in your work. But when we have established those three facts, the average American switches, and it's literally a switch, into, okay, I understand there's a problem, tell me the solution. Give me the 10-point plan. In Europe, establishing the existence of cultural differences is a given. We all know we're different from one another. Okay, we wouldn't have fought so many wars otherwise. Okay, so the existence of cultural differences it's like the air we breathe in Europe. Nobody has ever questioned that concept. Okay, where I find way more of a challenge is convincing Europeans that we can do something about making things better. Because for the average European, we've been fighting for 1,000 years. We'll probably keep fighting for another 1,000 years. What do you mean we can make things better? Okay, so there are definitely a lot of things that can be done to make things better.
So what concrete advice would you actually give an IT team that has just started to come together and work on a project? What should they focus on first?
Well, so one critical step in my experience is during the kickoff meeting, the first meeting of the whole team, and sometimes it's virtual, but I would really encourage people to do it in person if it can be afforded. It's allocate 20% of the meeting time to discuss the unwritten rules of the team. How do we work together? Because what I find is people, for example, don't take the time to define what being on time means. They don't take the time to define what being a good team player means, and so on. And even between North America and Europe, there are big differences as to what that means. So it really helps if we discuss it. The other thing is, you want to make it okay to discuss the way we work as a team in the team. In other words, like from time to time, the team leader or even the team members can say, hey, hang on a second, the way we're working together doesn't work for us because of this, okay? And then we can have a discussion as to what it is that's not working and how do you interpret it, what does it mean to us, you know, and look for something that works for everyone, okay? And in major projects, I would really encourage people to get someone to, it can be someone from their HR or the HR department or maybe someone external, to essentially guide them in that process. I mean, the bigger the project and most importantly, the longer it's expected to run, the more important this becomes. Okay, if you're going to work for a week together and then that's it, there's only so much so much misunderstanding you can get into. But if you do a project like you're going to redo the IT infrastructure of like you know, oil and gas company, or like some projects are going to take a year and a half or something like this, then it really makes a lot. That kind of investment upfront will really make a world of difference.
Okay, thank you very much for this interesting talk.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
You're most welcome. Thank you.